Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this collection of videos, we're going to take a look at a class that is going to model a user. We're going to look at instance and class level methods. So we're going to take a look at a factory method to be able to generate new objects. The whole reason for this class is to be able to save the state of an object. So we're going to actually be reading and writing from the file system. And then ultimately, we are going to wrap this class in a graphical user interface so that you can drive it both from the command line, but also then from a GUI. So to begin with, what we want to do is we really go and create a new project, Java with Ant for this one, Java application. And we're going to simply call this one user driver. We're going to put this in our EE333 package so that we can use it then later on. Now, we're going to come back to this user driver in just a little bit. First thing that we want to do, though, is we want to add a new Java class, and we're going to call it user. We're going to also put it under the EE333 package and then select finish. So we're going to spend most of this first video just simply building this class, adding the appropriate fields to make it useful, and then looking at the constructor and the different constructors that we're going to need. So to begin with, how are we going to describe our user? Well, you can think of them in terms of maybe a point of sale system or perhaps a library management system. So what you're going to see is that they're going to need things like a first name, a last name. For this, we're going to assume that we're also going to be capturing the address of the user, the city in which they live in, and then also the state. Now, I'll be sharing a link with you for some Oracle documentation on source coding guidelines for Java. And one of the topics in there will be about throwing exceptions in constructors versus having a flag. We're going to focus on the flag for right now, and we're going to do so by creating an enumerator. And we'll come back to this then later on. But we're also going to have an enumerator that we simply refer to as the status. And that is going to allow our user then to be active, inactive, or unknown. And we may add other states there as well. But what this does is this then allows for us to create a private enum field called status, and we're just going to call it then underscore s, lowercase s status. The other logical field that we might need here is going to be a unique ID for the user. And we can have a discussion on this, but for right now, we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to assume that this might be the user's email. So in this case, then we're just going to call it an ID, and we are going to assume it is the user's email or a unique auto-generated ID. Okay, and we're actually going to show you a little trick on how to create those. All right, so once again, we're going to be adding fields as we go along. This at least gets us started. There's plenty of additional things that we could add here. But the first discussion then we want to have is what access do we want to have for the fields of a object of this class? And that involves creating our getters and our setters. Now, We can do this manually, and we've done this manually before. But what we'd like to do to speed this up just a little bit is to right-click, go to refactor, and in this case, encapsulate the fields, and just leverage some of the tools that NetBeans provides for us. Now, this leads itself then to the discussion of what do we want to be changed externally by some other portion of code with respect to your object. And so questions that we want to ask yourself is, do you want the ID of the user to be changed after you have created the user? And the answer is probably more than likely not. Okay, so the idea is that the ID can be unique and is set at the time that the object is created. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and select all and then deselect the setter for the ID. And what this does is this means that after the object is created, the ID is essentially read-only. We probably also want to do the same thing then for the status, because we don't want code external to our object to be able to set the status, just merely get the status. Once again, we're going to be expanding then that status as we go along with this collection of projects here, a collection of examples. But we go ahead and hit refactor, and you can see that NetBeans uses a template then to simply create all of our getters and our setters, starting with our ID. Now, the next step in this is to create our constructors, which once again leads into a discussion about what our constructors need, what's the minimum information that the constructors need to successfully create a object. At the very least, you probably want them to pass some combination of the ID, the first name, and the last name. So we could provide more information, but that can be done then later on in the setters for the object. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus exclusively on a few parameters to begin with. So we're going to make two constructors. We're going to make them both public. So we have public user. And then for this first one, I'm going to accept a ID, my first name, and my last name. And then inside this constructor, we simply, we do need to do some error checking. But assuming that all of the validation passed, then we would simply do this dot ID, make this dot ID equals to ID, this dot first name equals to first name, and this dot last name equals to last name. Now, we're going to come back to this error checking in just a second. We also need to initialize the default values. So also need to initialize the default values. So just some quick notes here that we need. For our second constructor, what we're going to do is we're actually going to not provide the ID, but simply provide the first name and the last name, and then we're going to auto-generate the ID. Essentially, you can think of this as giving a suggestion to the user of what their ID should be. So we're going to say public user, and then string first name, string last name, and then once again, we would need to do some error checking here. But what we'll do here is we will generate the ID from the first name and last name. Other than that, though, we're going to have this dot first name equal to first name, and this dot last name equal to last name. And then additionally, we also need to initialize the default values. Now, before we go any further, I want us to see briefly what I was referring to in the Oracle documentation. If you go to this link right here, which I'll be providing, if you go to section 7 under the object construction, actually it talks about various approaches, security approaches to creating an object and what happens in the scenario in which the object is not completely initialized. In other words, you discover that you don't have all the information that you need. One possibility is that you throw an exception, which can lead to an exploit, which this article goes into. But then the second possibility is, and the one that we're going to take, is the idea of creating a flag. So they call it an initialize flag, which is secure. It can be a little cumbersome, but you can also use it then later on. What we've done is we've simply extended this flag concept out to an enumerator that you just simply check the state of. So the documentation gives you a couple of different ways to go about doing it. I'm going to show you both. I'm going to show you how you would do it if you were to create an exception. But I'm going to focus on the flag approach. Okay, so what would some of your basic initialization look like, or some of your basic validation look like? So I'm going to, for this example, rather than stack our constructors to begin with, I'm just going to focus on the second constructor where we are providing the ID, the first name, and the last name. And essentially, all three of these fields are going to be required. So a simple check would just simply be if the field was null or that the length was equal to 0. So then what we want to do here is we want to have an if statement. We would want to check to see if ID equal to null or ID dot length equal to 0. And under either of these cases, then we would simply want to either throw an exception or raise or set the flag appropriately on the status, letting then the consumer of this object know that the user is not completely initialized. All right. So in this particular case, I want to show how to throw an exception. So we can say here, throw new, and I'm going to say java.lang. In this case, a legal argument exception. That's while it is a generic exception, it is more specific than just simply java.lang.exception, so that can be handled then by the consumer here. So we're going to throw the legal argument exception, and the message we're going to provide here is that error, no valid ID provided. Now, we can continue on with this theme here. We can have a else if. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to say first name equal to null or then our first name dot length equal to 0. And once again, we're going to throw a new java.lang.illegal argument exception, error, no valid first name provided. And I think you can quickly see our pattern here. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and grab that line of code, and I'm just going to copy and paste it in just a second. And in this case, what we want to do now is we want to do the same thing now for the last name, or last name dot length equal to 0. And then finally, if we have survived all of our error checking or validation, then under the else is where you would go about setting these fields. Okay, and then the last step then we would want to do, as our notes tell us, is to go ahead and initialize the default values. And so that would be the address, the city, and the state. Okay, those are deemed not essential at the point of the construction of the object. Okay, in other words, they can be set later. Now, the last thing that you want to do up here is in your constructor, after your constructor, and you want to let any consumer of your constructor know that this user constructor can throw an exception. And so it's going to throw a java.lang.illegal argument exception. Okay, and that just allows then for the consumer of your user know to what kind of exceptions that would be potentially thrown by this constructor. So this is now one approach. Okay, this is not going to be the approach that I'm going to take universally, but I want you to be aware of this. And what this does is this then passes and control back to the calling code, the calling function that attempted to construct this user, and then that must be handled then upstream. In our other constructor now, I'm going to do it with a flag so you can see both methods, and then ultimately what we'll do is we'll switch this second constructor back to the flag approach. So in this constructor, then what we're going to do is instead of throwing an exception, we are going to use our status enum as a flag to determine whether or not the object was properly initialized. And so to do that, basically the first line of this constructor would just simply set the status equal to, and I'm going to go ahead and use the full path here. So EE333 dot status dot unknown. And once again, unknown is just going to be a catch-all status for right now. We can expand on this later. You're going to see concepts like is dirty, is blocked. There's a number of different statuses that you could use, basically to let the caller know that something either is going on, if it's a asynchronous process, or something went wrong, if it's going to be used in this context right here. Now, as far as the error checking, this is not substantially different than last time. And what we want to do here is we simply want to check to see that the first name, we check to see if the first name is null, or if the first name dot length is equal to 0, and rather than throw an exception, which you can, basically at this point you're going to capture control of the code so that you're not going to complete the initialization of your user. Okay, so more can be done here, but at the very least, make sure the status is unknown or failed. Okay, so make sure the status is either unknown or, let's say, incomplete. So what we could do then is we could come down here to our enum, and we could, for instance, add another status here. So we're going to call this one incomplete. So now up here in our constructor, we simply say this dot status is going to be equal to EE333 dot status dot incomplete. Continue this pattern with the other ones. So last name equal to null, or last name dot length equal to 0, in which case then this dot status is equal to E33 dot status dot incomplete. Now, under the else, this is where we want to construct the ID. So I'm going to come up here. I'm actually going to borrow our comment here. I'm going to move it down here because this is where it then becomes relevant. And at the very least, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and move these two lines of code inside of the else branch. Now, regarding initializing the default values, we can handle this a number of ways. Notice though we've captured the flow of control of our code in the first two branches under the assumption that there was something wrong with either the first name or the last name fields. So anything that we don't initialize in the body of this constructor, then we need to specifically initialize inside these branches. And there's a couple of different ways that you can handle this. You can have one final check then to see if something is complete or incomplete. But what we can do, at the very least, is outside, we can initialize our address, our city, our state, okay? And we will leave, since we're handling the enum elsewhere, we're going to leave the enum alone. And then inside each one of these branches here, we want to simply handle the fields that are not correctly handled. So this dot ID, this dot first name, this dot last name. And we can do the same now in the second branch. And then, for instance, you can decide if it's just the first name that is null, do you still want to set the last name? Likewise, if the last name is null, do you want to set the first name? So there's a couple of different possibilities here. Also note this does get us into a little bit of a problem in that we do not have a way to set the ID once the object is created. So we would need to decide what do we do with a user object that is essentially incomplete because we're not going to be able to modify it then later. But once again, since we can't change the status outside of our object, perfectly fine, maybe fine for the system that we're creating. All right, so hopefully you see now then the two differences here. Okay, so the two possible ways of approaching the constructor. So I'm gonna stop this video here. Once again, this is gonna be part of a collection of videos. When you join me again, I'm gonna have modified my second constructor to match my first one, and then we'll pick up from there.